In this video, we're going to talk about using the Toulmin Model of Argument to analyze and evaluate other people's arguments. And the purpose of this lecture is to give you another tool in your toolbox for analyzing and critiquing the arguments that other people make, which again is the focus of the second unit in our class. The Toulmin model was invented by a British philosopher named Stephen Toulmin, who studied various theories of reasoning, particularly moral reasoning. And the Toulmin model is a way of breaking down the components of arguments into individual parts so that we can kind of diagram an argument and see how it's working and see whether all the parts of the argument are working together. And in doing so, we hope that we can maybe isolate some weaknesses or places that an argument could be improved. So let's back up just a little bit and talk about what an argument is. I feel like we intuitively kind of understand what an argument is, and yet when I ask students to write essays that involve arguments, frequently I wind up with thesis statements that look a little bit like this. So something like, say for a literature class, in this paper, I'm going to analyze Act 1, Scene 1 of Shakespeare's Hamlet to determine how the playwright establishes the psychology of the main character. So you may notice that this statement contains many elements that I guess are good in terms of defining a topic or the focus of an essay, but it isn't really an argument yet. Okay, I think we can agree on that. Likewise, another common formulation that I might see in this paper, I'm going to attempt to answer the age-old question, where did Hamlet go wrong? Now, this is an interesting research question, but it is not actually an argument. Okay, so in papers that you're going to write later in this unit, I'm going to be asking you to make evaluative arguments about somebody else's writing. I'm going to be asking you to look at articles written by other people and to evaluate what they have said. And an evaluation is an argument in and of itself. And so I do expect that I'm going to see at least some papers that contain formulations like this, where you're going to say, I'm going to analyze blah, 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 or I am going to try to answer this question, like I'm going to try to figure out if this is a good argument or not. Again, that's just the assignment. That's just what you're being asked to do. You haven't yet made an argument yourself just yet. Okay, so in order for something to be an argument, it needs to contain a couple of elements. First of all, it needs to contain a claim. And a claim is a statement that we can argue for whether or not it is true. Okay, the problem with the statements on this previous slide is that they aren't really truth claims. You're just telling me what you're doing. And because you're the one doing the thing, like we can't dispute whether that's true. Are you analyzing Act 1, Scene 1 of Shakespeare's Hamlet? No. Like this is like it's not an argument. You're just describing what you're doing. Okay, it's just description. Likewise, asking a question isn't an argument either. An argument needs to contain a disputable claim. Something where we can have different opinions on whether or not it is true, or we can summon different evidence for whether or not it's true. And the claim should ideally be supported by reasons, by other statements that support the original claim, that make it likely that your audience will accept it as true. Okay, so a common formula for an argument would be something like X is true because of Y and Z. Okay, so when you are writing one of your evaluation assignments where you're evaluating or critiquing somebody else's argument, you would say something like, this author makes a good argument because blah, 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 blah. Okay, because of this reason and that reason. Okay, you'd give either maybe this argument is a good argument because it contains strong objective evidence, or because it's structured very well, or this is not a good argument because it contains a lot of logical fallacies, which is something that we're going to learn about next week. So the claim tells us that something is true. It proposes an idea that you're saying is true, something you want to persuade us is true. And the reasons give us reasons why we ought to think or believe your original claim. Okay? So if we want to kind of come up with an example argument. It could be something like this. Let's say that I have a friend who smokes, and I want to convince my friend that he should stop. Okay? So my main argument is that you should stop smoking. You, my friend, should stop smoking. And let's say I give a couple of reasons why that's the case. I say you should stop smoking because it's bad for your health, and also it costs a lot of money. Okay, so this is kind of the foundation of the Toulmin model. Okay, is the claim and the reasons, the truth, the thing we're asserting as true, and the reasons for believing that it is true. But there are more things that have to go into this in order to make it a truly convincing argument. I'm sure my friend has heard before that smoking is bad for his health and knows very well that it is expensive because he, after all, is the one buying the cigarettes. So we need more to this argument in order to make it persuasive. Okay, one important thing to understand here is that the reasons we offer in support of a claim are often just additional assertions. So in like claims, they are arguments that also need to be supported. Okay, so in addition to our claim and reasons, we are going to need evidence. All right, we're going to need to add evidence to this. Reasons to believe that our reasons are reasonable. Okay, so we can add to this structure of an argument that an argument contains a claim plus reasons plus evidence. And if we expand our formula, we can say X is true because of Y based on Z. The relationship or the difference between reasons and evidence is described by Wayne Booth in The Craft of Research, which you ideally read before watching this video. Reasons are generally the product of reasoning, so they're things that we think of, through the process of inference. I have some general idea that smoking is bad for your health. I've heard that before. It seems like a reasonable thing to say, when trying to convince somebody to stop smoking. But it's something that I've generated inside my head. When you're writing exam essays, for example, usually what you're dealing with is just purely claims and reasons because you aren't allowed to do any outside research, and so you can't really reasonably offer hard evidence. Evidence is stuff we get from out there in the world. It's the product of research. So whereas a reason might be a statement like smoking is bad for your health, evidence would be something external to me that I can point to say why I have reason to believe that smoking is bad for your health. So it might be something like medical studies, So in support of this reason, I might offer a study linking smoking to certain diseases, saying, say, you're more likely to get emphysema or lung cancer or have other health problems as a result of smoking. Or, say, a study showing smoking is associated with early death. I can do the same thing with the reason that it costs a lot of money. I can point to the price of a pack of cigarettes and show how that adds up over time, depending on how much you smoke. I could even look at it not just in terms of personal finance, but in terms of cost to society. So I could look to an article or an estimate by the CDC or the World Health Organization talking about the total cost of smoking to society in terms of lost productivity and healthcare costs. Okay, so this is evidence. What makes this evidence is that it's something that's external to me. I didn't just make it up. It's something that I found as a product of my research that I'm offering as evidence that the reason is, well, reasonable. And that therefore, if the reasons are reasonable, then then perhaps my listener will be persuaded by my claim. There's an additional element to think about here, and this is kind of the trickiest one, which is that in addition to reasons and evidence, the Toulmin model also asks us to think about something called warrants. And warrants are often invisible in an argument. They're often things that we aren't explicitly stating. If we kind of take our basic model of an argument, claim plus reasons plus evidence, X is true because of Y based on Z, then the warrant is whatever reason we have for thinking that Z is good evidence for Y. Okay, so the warrant is the logic that allows us to say that Z actually supports Y, that Z is good evidence in this case. So it's like another way to think about it is that it's an underlying assumption that links the evidence back to the main claim and the reason. Warrants can be either explicit, so it can be something that you directly explain to a reader, or it can be implicit. And whether or not it remains explicit, whether you have to explain it or whether you just leave it unsaid depends substantially on the audience. It depends on who it is you're talking to, who you're trying to persuade. So if we go back to this outline, this Toulmin model of the smoking argument, the warrant that makes these two pieces of evidence for this reason is a kind of general idea that medical studies are reasonable guides for personal behavior. Okay, if we say that a study linking smoking to certain diseases is evidence for smoking being bad for your health and that therefore you should stop, then what we're essentially saying is that you ought to base your personal behavior, your decisions about smoking, on medical research. And for many of us, maybe even most of us, that would be a reasonable assumption. I think most people consider what medical science discovers to be pretty good guides for personal behavior. If medical science tells you that something is dangerous, then maybe it is something that you ought to avoid. But the problem is that many of us don't live like that. We don't always look at what medical studies tell us and use it to guide our personal behavior. So even though, like in some, I guess, ideal sense, this is an argument to hold that all holds together. Once we reveal the warrant, once we understand what the underlying logic of this is, we begin to see some of the weaknesses, which is that just because I'm able to point to medical studies that say that smoking is dangerous doesn't mean that my friend is necessarily going to change his mind. He may be able to, maybe he doesn't trust medicine, for example. Maybe he's very skeptical of medical science. We encounter that kind of skepticism in various other realms of life, such as vaccines. So maybe he's the type of person for whom this is simply not convincing, and therefore my argument that he should listen to medical studies is not going to be persuasive. Or, in many cases, medical science can even conflict with personal experience because scientific studies deal with population level effects and deal with effects over very, very large numbers of people. Not every individual is going to be affected by somebody in the same way. So just because we say that there is a statistical link between smoking and lung cancer doesn't mean that every single smoker is going to get lung cancer. So the idea that this is like some kind of prophecy about what is going to happen to you, that's not necessarily true. If you promise somebody that they're going to get lung cancer because they smoke, there's a very statistical reality that you could be entirely wrong. Likewise, with the argument that smoking costs a lot of money, because here what I'm assuming is that it's unreasonable to do things that are pleasurable if they cost a lot of money. Smoking is not a productive activity, it's something that people do because it feels good. And by this same logic, I would have to declare a whole bunch of other activities, even activities that we think are harmless, to be bad because they cost money. Okay, so eating at restaurants costs a lot of money. Playing video games can, depending on what you do, cost a lot of money in equipment and subscriptions to service to various services or purchasing games, that kind of thing. Um, uh, Playing sports costs money. And these are all things that are not explicitly necessary to our lives, but we do because we enjoy them, because they are pleasurable. So this warrant, once we reveal the warrant behind this argument, suddenly it kind of becomes clear that I'm taking a very puritanical attitude towards my friend's habit. And that therefore, like, this friend may not really share that value, may feel like, well, sure, it costs a lot of money, but I can afford it. And it just so happens to be worth it to me because it feels good. Okay. So again, what's valuable about understanding warrants is that once you are able to reveal the implicit logic at work in an argument, very often weaknesses start to show up. And therefore, if you want to criticize somebody's argument, if you have this feeling that something is just not holding together, then it may be because the evidence is unwarranted or that there isn't a good logical connection between the evidence and the claims that are actually being made. This, by the way, is also a fairly good sign that an argument is engaging in some kind of logical fallacy, and we're going to talk more about that next week. All right. So, because the warrants may not always be accepted by the person who I am trying to persuade, I am also going to have to deal with the objections or rebuttals that my friend might make. Okay. And this really completes the entire Toulmin model. We have our claim, our reasons, our evidence, our warrants, which in this case are implicit. And once we've talked about them, it actually turns out that they're kind of weak, and then my friend, of course, has the opportunity to respond. And so to complete the Toulmin model, we need to consider what rebuttals my friend might make. Okay, so my friend might say in response, well, I see all of that medical evidence that you've shown me, but my grandfather smoked a pack a day until he was 96 and he never had any problems. And again, this gets to kind of the weakness of that particular warrant, because like we said, population level studies or studies of how um, some behavior affects the health of a very large group of people doesn't necessarily tell us about what is going to happen to any one individual. So while so it may very well be the case that my friend has a grandfather who was a big smoker, but who died of something completely different than what we traditionally associate with smoking, or never had any particular health problems that we would attribute to smoking. So, in response to that, I might need to qualify that argument. So, this is sometimes called the response, sometimes called the qualifier or the limitation. I need to place limitations on how I am using this evidence so that I'm less likely to be discredited. Okay, so I can say to my friend, well, we're talking in terms of statistical probability. Yeah, your grandfather didn't have any problems and he was 96, but do you really want to take that chance? Like, it sounds like your grandfather was actually just very, very lucky, and you might not be that lucky. Okay. Likewise, my friend may just look at this entire argument and say, well, listen, it's my body and I can do what I want with it, and that's absolutely true. But I can simply say, well, I'm just making my personal recommendation because I care about you. I'm not suggesting that smoking ought to be completely illegal or that, you ought to be thrown in jail for doing it. I'm just saying that I care about you and I would like you to stop smoking. Okay, so this kind of completes the overall Toulmin model. We have our claim, our reasons, our evidence. We understand what the implicit warrants are. We have thought about rebuttals that the person on the other side of the argument might make, and we've thought about responses or qualifications that we can put on the argument in order to make it more credible, in order to deal better with those particular objections. This completes our discussion of the Toulmin model. What I'm going to ask you to do next is read an article on your own and then participate in a discussion where you're going to try to identify all of these elements yourself. Okay, so I will see you in the discussion thread.